get started here. In this section, we're going to discuss the idea of the security threat landscape. So really what kind of things do we have to worry about when we start dealing with the idea of security on our network, right? And how does that really work? And they mentioned the idea of where it is we're looking for it. Obviously, when you're dealing with threat defense, it's pretty much every device. We're looking for what we call defense in depth. One of the things we first started with is the idea of perimeter security, right? Keep the internet away from my internal network. What we found out, however, was that 70% of all malicious attacks actually start from inside the network, right? And there are all sorts of different attacks that we could potentially have available for us. Right? They show things like we have viruses, we have Trojan horses that we could see within here. So there are issues with things like, what do we have for operating system information? So there are a lot of different things that we have to think about when we start talking about what we do for security. And they mentioned a threat is any circumstance or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset in the form of destruction, disclosure, an adverse modification of data, or denial of service. Now, what I want you to recognize is that it's not necessarily somebody that's purposely doing something, right? You can have threats from people that just simply have the rights to be able to do things that they shouldn't have, right? For instance, I worked at a company at one point in time where a guy had the availability and rights to be able to delete information from a shared network drive. He inadvertently thought that that was on his local hard drive. So he deleted a whole bunch of stuff from other people that were on that shared drive, just thinking it was on his local hard drive, and his local hard drive was saying it was low on disk space. Right? So he started deleting a whole bunch of stuff that he thought was other people's files that were on his local hard drive. Well, the problem with that is that just simply he had the rights to be able to do things that he probably shouldn't have been able to do. Okay, so there's some things that you look at where that obviously it caused destruction of data, but not necessarily an intentional malicious attack that we're dealing with at that point. They mentioned the idea of vulnerability, a weakness that compromises either the security or the functionality of a system. Now, this could be all sorts of different things. It could be a vulnerability in the operating system that we have. It could be a vulnerability in the application that somebody's using. Right? It could be a vulnerability in the program being used. Right? Maybe it's not necessarily an HTTP thing, but based off of the browser that you're using, there's a vulnerability in the browser that we're dealing with. And so that becomes a big thing. And they show some of these things could be things, just simple, easy things like weak passwords or easily guessed passwords that we're dealing with. Those are considered vulnerabilities. I love seeing, I don't know if you guys can see this, right here is where I typically see vulnerabilities occur quite often in local networks. The idea is someone put their username and password on a sticky note and they put it up on their monitor so that they can remember what their username and password is. That becomes a big vulnerability. Or the tricky people who put it underneath their keyboard or underneath their mouse pad that you're dealing with. Always going to be something that we can see as a big vulnerability on that network. Simply just logging into your device and then walking away and leaving your device up and running and connected to the network with someone else can potentially come and walk down, just start sitting down and start making changes. Okay? So that's obviously a vulnerability. And then they're talking about things like exploits. It's a mechanism that you use that uses a vulnerability to compromise the security or functionality of the system. Again, this might be something like the vulnerability is a bug in the software. And once I know what that vulnerability is, how do I attack that vulnerability and exploit what's going on within that system at that point? Obviously, anytime we deal with the idea of security, one of the things we have to do is make sure we do some type of a risk assessment. Right? What is the consequence of our company losing all of our data that we have available for us? Right? How long is it going to take us to be able to go through and mitigate that? How long is it going to take for us to go through and restore all that data from backups that we may potentially have? When was the last time we had a backup? All of these things are incrementing or decreasing the amount of risk that we have. And risk is going to be different based off of everybody's different network that we have. You're going to see, again, sunset learning not necessarily the hugest risk that we have available. We have data, don't get me wrong, and there's some security that has to be dealt with at that point in time, but our risk is much lower than, say, the National Security Association, okay? So there's always sorts of things, the DoD, for instance, right? That's gonna be a much bigger risk, and therefore, because the risk is higher, what they have for security has to be higher as well, okay? And so we're finally looking into the mitigation techniques. How do we go through and try and do our best to stop these vulnerabilities and stop these exploits from occurring on the network itself? Now, obviously, they're not talking about the idea of completely getting rid of it, right? It's mitigation, right? Give us the idea of how much can we have for security and what really lowers our risk is what we're really looking for, okay? Not necessarily always being perfect as far as security is concerned, right? You think about it at your house. We're locking doors, and that's what we've done to make sure that nobody breaks into our house when they're gone. Now, that's a mitigation technique. Doesn't necessarily say someone couldn't break a window, right? There's always things that could potentially be there. Now, what do we deal with when we're dealing with windows? Well, if I want to make sure that no one breaks my window, well, then I've added in things like I want to have some type of an alarm system go off within there, right? Well, alarm system is great, but if no one hears it, who really deals with it, right? So the idea that I've connected my alarm system out to whoever, some service provider that can call the police, they can call fire, they can call all sorts of different things, medical evaluations. So the idea is that mitigation is always different based off of what you've got for risk, okay? Now they show some of the malware that we're trying to stop and mitigate on our network. Obviously we have viruses. They mentioned it's malware that goes through and propagates itself by inserting a copy of itself into another program. The idea is that you play that program, and then it installs things in the background, essentially, so that you don't have any idea that it's actually occurring. Typically, what you're going to see is that this moves from one computer to another computer as well, leaving infections as it goes through and travels from one location to another location. We have things like worms, a computer worm, similar to a virus. The big difference, they're replicating themselves in copies between different systems. The big difference is that it doesn't necessarily have itself with another program. Okay? They're standalone software. They don't require some kind of host process that's going through and have someone double click on something to propagate that network. Okay? And then last but not least, we have Trojan horses. As they show, it's a harmful piece of software that looks like a legitimate file that you're trying to open. Okay? You see this a lot in phishing attacks, where they go through and they send you an email, and it might come from, let's say, the CEO's email address is what it looks like to begin with. And they give you a file, and you double click on that, well, all of a sudden that's malicious software being installed on that system. Okay? And a lot of times what you're seeing within there is that we're doing this with a denial of service attack. Now, a denial of service attack is, the whole idea is just to say, I'm going to send so much information that it overwhelms the system out over here, which means that the victim's infrastructure, they can't get outbound anymore. Okay? And a lot of times what you're seeing in this is what they call a distributed denial of service attack. I've used a worm or a virus or a Trojan horse to infect a whole bunch of different systems, and once I get enough systems that can allow me to overwhelm the system on the real victim's device that's out over here, what we do is we make sure that all of these different bots that we've set up out over here have infected as many possible people as we can, hundreds of thousands of different devices. And then all of a sudden we have at our command and control, the actual attacker that we're dealing with out over here uses those bots to go through and say, let's overwhelm the system of the true intended victim that we're looking for. You see this happen to Microsoft, you see it happen to Cisco and to Google all the time, as a matter of fact. People going through and trying that denial of service. So the idea is to be able to recognize all the different devices that are going through and looking for the exact same thing and mitigating that by going through and saying, hey, we've got things like an IPS or a firewall or policing on the outside interface. We got things that we can use within BGP to stop this traffic from coming inbound. So there are all sorts of different options that we can use to try and mitigate this denial of service attack. We have spoofing attacks. Spoofing attacks happen all the time. In this case out over here, notice that this guy is trying to send information. But an attacker at a 172.25.9.7 address, and that attacker goes through and sends traffic outbound. Notice the traffic that they're sending outbound. The source IP address is a 192.168.6.4, the intended victim that's down out over here. They're sending this out, think of a TCP SYN that goes out onto the server at 10.1.2.3. That server then sends a SYN-ACK, and in this case, it goes to the real 192.168.6.4 address. Well, this user down here on the bottom says, hey, I never started that conversation. I don't know why you're sending me a SYN-ACK. And essentially what it does is it says, drop that, because I didn't try and connect. Well, that leaves this open TCP session at this location at 10.1.2.3. Right? Using memory, waiting around, saying, I'm expecting to receive a final acknowledgement and then TCP traffic coming through. Right? And if I do that enough with different source IP addresses, I overwhelm the memory that we've got on the server over here with these open connections, not fully three-way handshake finished connections in TCP. Now, that's not the only type of spoofing attack that we can have. There's ARP spoofing, there's IP address spoofing that we have. We have reflection attacks that we can deal with. Right? Here we see an attacker. They're sending out ICP echo requests from 10.1.1.5 to the network broadcast address. Right? Because it's a network broadcast address, it goes to everybody. It goes to that network and then outbound to everybody on that network, on that link. Now, and what they're saying in this case right here, notice that they're sending it with the source IP address. My source IP address 10.1.1.5 is the victim down out over here. And because I've sent it out onto all of these different users, they then send back a response, an ICMP response to that. This guy's overwhelmed by ICMP echoes coming, or echo replies coming back inbound, okay? Can cause all sorts of different issues. Again, typically not going to be an individual user's PC. It might be something like a server that we're trying to block and get denial of service on, okay? Here we can see things like social engineering. The idea that I'm trying to make a website look as if it is some type of bank or whatever it may be. In this case, they're giving you this idea of this big bank. So I make a website that looks just like that bank's website. Right? The idea is now I'm going to go through and play around with things like DNS. As someone goes through and does a DNS request, hey, I want to get to this bigbank.com, I send you a DNS response saying, hey, the IP address is a 192.168.254.254. My fake website that I've got out over here. You connect to that fake website and it says, give me your username and password. And they say, here's my username and password. And typically what you'll see out of that is saying, oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong username and password. Please reply, try again. What they're trying to do is they're trying to get you to put it in multiple times so that I know it is indeed your username and password. Once you've done that, I can go through and say, well, you know what, we've locked out your account right now, okay? So now the attacker can use that information, this username and password, to try and connect to the real bigbank.com and try and drain your account. We also see that phishing would be that DNS poisoning that we're dealing with. Right? So as the user tries to go through and get to that bigbank.com, I'm redirecting them to a 192.168.254.254 and asking for their username and password. Okay? They're trying to get to their regular online banking. What you might even see to kind of get this to be something that looks a little bit different, right, is that I send a request out over here, and then this server that we've got for the attacker actually sends it out onto the real bigbank.com, right? So you can actually see it as a man-in-the-middle type of situation. I get to allow that transaction to actually occur back and forth so that the user doesn't think of anything suspicious. Right? Now that they disconnect from that bigbank.com, now it's time for me to go through and drain their account. Okay? So that can be a big issue as well. Obviously, we have attacks on passwords as well. Right? And there are all sorts of different attacks on passwords. We mentioned things like just simple guessing of passwords. Right? That happens all the time when you start dealing with people that go to training seminars, to tell you the truth, right? I remember when we were teaching some Microsoft stuff, it was amazing how many people would use the same username and password that they used in the Microsoft classes for that, right? Rather than creating their own username and password for it, right? Think of the idea of having a server that has a username of administrator and a password of password, or even PASSW0RD, right? So we've got all sorts of different things you could potentially have. So simple guessing that we look for to try and get us to have that idea of what your username and password is. We look for brute force attacks. Brute force attacks just try different username and password combinations over and over and over again until we find one that potentially works, right? So you got all sorts of different brute force attacks that we can deal with. And they've even created software like Jack the Ripper, Nmap. They've got all sorts of different things that can allow us to automatically do these brute force attacks. Now, some of these guys also have the availability to do a dictionary attack. We're trying to go through and say, hey, I want to make up any password that is a word in the dictionary, if at all possible. And it's one of the reasons why, when we look for strong passwords, we look for how long is that password. It takes longer to do a brute force attack when it's a longer password. We look for things like, I need to have uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numeric characters. And the reason why, it doesn't show up in a dictionary is the reason why. Okay? A lot of times you'll also see like special characters can't be added into a brute force attack because it's just a simple number of combinations in that case becomes a big problem. And they show they've got reconnaissance attacks. And reconnaissance attacks are all about the idea, it's not really malicious per se. What I'm doing in this case is I'm trying to find out information about a company so that I can use that information to eventually exploit some type of vulnerability that they've got on that network. So here they're just looking at the idea of going through and using simple thing that you get on any Windows host itself, the whois availability, right? Just finding out as a whois query who owns this website. So they're saying whoisexample.com in this case, right? I'm looking for that particular domain name. And they show things like what street address is that domain name registered to, what the town is, our postal code, our phone numbers that we have within here, whose email are they using for that registration of that domain name that we're dealing with, right? What kind of name servers do they have in DNS? So we can try and exploit the DNS information that we're dealing with. Right? So lots of different things that we could potentially see as that exploited attack here. Here we talk about the idea of a man-in-the-middle attack. And again, what we mentioned in this case is the whole idea is I want traffic going from this host A to host B, back and forth between the two, to go through the attacker's PC. And a lot of times it's done based off of an ARP poisoning attack in this case. Right? Notice what they're sending out. The attacker is saying, hey, I know you're trying to talk to 10.1.1.4, host B out over here. And you've done an ARP request. Whoever is 10.1.1.4, send me back your MAC address. They've sent back their MAC address as an ARP reply. Now my attacker goes through and sends out what we call a gratuitous ARP. And a gratuitous ARP is an unsolicited ARP response to the broadcast address. All right, so what they're saying is, I am 10.1.1.4, here's my new MAC address. My MAC address is MAC address D, the attacker's MAC address up over here. Right? So the idea is that that poisons what's going on within the ARP cache at host A. Now they're saying, hey, to get to 10.1.1.4, I'm going to send that information to MAC address D. Notice the other direction. They've gone through and said, hey, I'm also 10.1.1.3, and I've got a new MAC address B. And MAC address D out over here eventually gets through, and host B, you see their ARP request of their ARP cache poisoned again. They're sitting here saying, all right, 10.1.1.3 is now MAC address D. So the traffic that goes from host A to host B goes outbound to that MAC address. That user then, once they've captured that traffic, can send it to the real MAC address of MAC address B. The response coming from host B, again, gets sent outbound to the MAC address of D, which then I forward on to the MAC address A. And I become that man in the middle, seeing all that traffic that goes back and forth between these two hosts. Now, we can also look at things like an ARP flooding attack. Right? The idea is that normally this switch in the middle here is using source and destination MAC address to determine which physical interface are we going to send that traffic outbound on. So you might see the idea that an attacker goes through and floods. They send out a whole bunch of source MAC addresses that are fictitious MAC addresses. And what we do is we send out frames that the switch reads the source MAC address and the port it came in on and puts that into its MAC address table. And if I send those out millions of packets at a time with a whole bunch of different fictitious MAC addresses, I overwhelm what you've got in your MAC address table over here in the switch. Eventually throwing out all the real MAC addresses for all these fictitious MAC addresses. And the idea being is that now when a user tries to send data, I know how to go to host B, but the switch doesn't have that in its MAC address table anymore. And when I don't have a MAC address in my MAC address table, the default would be to flood that frame out every interface except for the port it came in on. So I've essentially gone through and said, based off of flooding the MAC address table of the switch, I've turned that VLAN into a big hub, where the switches always just simply send traffic out every single interface. And again, I can capture traffic between host A and host B at this attacker's PC. So quite a few different attacks that we need to worry about, and obviously the mitigation of those attacks are going to be a big deal for us. So what we're looking to do is to be able to say, how can we mitigate those attacks? And there's all sorts, it depends again on what we're looking for as far as the different types of attacks. Right? When we're looking for viruses or Trojans, or we're dealing with the idea of any kind of worm on that network, we might look for things like antivirus software that we're looking for. Right? Make sure that we try and mitigate that at the individual endpoints. We might look for things like intrusion prevention systems that can block malicious traffic on there. We might look for things like dynamic ARP inspection to block some of these ARP requests that are being sent outbound. DHCP snooping that we can utilize to make sure we don't have a rogue DHCP server on that network. So there are lots of different things that we use for mitigation of these techniques. Okay, so that's kind of what I have for you guys for this particular tech talk. Are there any questions before we go ahead? All right, well, then I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go for this hour. And what we're going to do is we're going to have another hour. In the next hour, we're going to go through and talk about how we implement some of these mitigation techniques as well. So please feel free to join me again at 10 o'clock, and we'll go through our mitigation techniques. Okay? Thank you guys for showing up.